So basically, the objective is to understand the basic principles, theories, and techniques of petroleum economics. And petroleum economics is very, very broad. So it's more or less how the petroleum resources are being managed, basically. So as we are dealing with oil, gas, and other minerals taxation, we as tax people, we need to first of all understand what really goes into the oil and gas industry, the operations, the regulators, the legal framework, there are various accounting methods, certain terminologies, because if you do not have that understanding, you cannot be able to tax. And it's applicable in all other industries as well. Then we'll also be conversant with the regulatory framework of the oil, gas, and other mineral sectors. So just like I mentioned earlier, there are some legalities, some regulatory bodies that we need to familiarize ourselves with in terms of their compositions, their objectives, and then their functions as well. Then C, to understand the fiscal regime of the oil, gas, and other mineral industry. So basically today, we're also going to look at the fiscal regime. The fiscal regime looks at how the cost and then the benefits in relation to the oil and gas production are shared. Okay, so worldwide, we have about 3 main but 4 fiscal regime. So this actually informs a particular host government, what that government, and I mean how the costs accruing from the petroleum operations and then the benefits accruing from the petroleum operations are going to be shared. The petroleum operations is a joint venture, so which means that there are so many parties coming on board. Obviously, because it's a joint venture, there's going to be also be the cost sharing. So the parties are going to pool their resources together so that the operations can be undertaken. So if these people or these parties are pooling their resources together, how are the costs going to be shared? And how are the benefits going to be shared, especially taking into consideration government involvement? Okay, so we are going to be looking at all these things. And D is to apply from A to C. The application is very, very important. When we go through the past question, you begin to understand what I'm talking about. So the introduction and then the fundamentals of petroleum economics, I call it the background phase. The background phase. It clearly gives you an overview of what goes into the petroleum and then the mining sector. So remember, the name of the course is oil, gas, and other minerals taxation. If that is the case, meaning that we are going to delve into the oil, which is petroleum, and then other minerals. So for this session, the other minerals will be looking at mining, the mining sector, which is mainly the gold, okay, the gold industry. So with the introduction, we will take a look at the ownership of the petroleum resources and then minerals as well. Who owns the oil? Who owns the gas? Who owns the gold? It's very, very important. So is it that when some discovery is made and perhaps it's in a particular jurisdiction, does it mean that the inhabitants of those jurisdictions are those who are owning the natural resources? So Article 257, subsection 6, subsection 7 of the Constitution of Ghana will give us the answer to this question. Then we'll also take a look at the acquisition of the petroleum and then the mineral rights, the rationale for having a unique tax regime for the extractive industry. So the extractive industry, that is the natural resource sector, is a highly specialized industry. Okay, most importantly, because they give some form of financial support to every host government. And then also they have a lot of uses. So for instance, when you take a look at the oil and gas sector, is an industry that will provide an input to the energy industry, transportation industry, manufacturing industry, the automobile industry. So it's a highly economical industry, be it that it's in a way contribute to the production capacity of every country or every host government. So if that is the case, we also need to take a look at the tax aspect of it, how we are going to tax such an industry. Then we also have aims and objectives of the state and investors to venture into the extractive industry. So what is the government looking out for? What are investors also looking out for? Mostly in Ghana, the big oil and gas players are multinational. So like the Tullow, the Newmont, which is the mining sector, the ExxonMobil. So they are mostly multinational. So what are their objectives in venturing into such an extractive industry? Please hold on. They also have the preemption right. The preemption right basically looks at if, let's say, there is supposed to be some form of right that needs to be exercised. So which means that certain people or certain parties to the petroleum operations are going to be given that priority such that they can be able to exercise their right. So we have the pre-license phase, the reconnaissance phase, prospecting phase. These are basically the phases that are tied to the specific stages in the operations when it comes to the oil and gas and in the mining sector. So we have the right acquisition or contracting phase, exploration phase, evaluation and appraisal phase. We'll be looking at some of these today. Then right down to surrender of mineral rights, suspension and cancellation of mineral rights, sometimes due to certain conditions or circumstances. Once a person or a party obtains the right, and that party cannot be able to go on with the mineral operations or the petroleum operations, then in as much as the right or the license was obtained, then it would also have to be returned back or relinquished. We have something called relinquishment in the oil and gas sector. So basically, even before one can be given the mandate to operate, be it the oil and gas or the mining, one needs to obtain a right or a license. You cannot just stand up and then you begin to exploit our natural resources because there are so many stakeholders pertaining to such an industry. So you need to go to the right authorities and then the license, certain applications will need to be done, certain assessments by the applicable authorities, and then the license would be released to that particular party. Now, looking at the fundamentals of petroleum economics, this basically deals with the interaction between the petroleum industry and then the economy as a whole, So as we move on, we are going to look at what really influences the oil and gas prices, what really influences it. So sometimes you get to hear that fuel prices are increasing and then people begin to rush and buy fuel. Okay, so there are certain factors that drives such actions by potential buyers. Now, when it comes to the regulatory framework basically looks at the legalities pertaining to such a sector. Obviously, there are certain laws, certain agreements, certain regulations, certain acts that governs the administration of the oil and gas and then the mining sector in Ghana. So for instance, we have the Petroleum Exploration and then the Production Act. Okay, so when you read such an act, of which I would advise everybody to get it, okay, you can just download it online or I'll give it to you later on. You begin to understand the oil and gas industry. Okay, you begin to understand the oil and gas industry. Then we also have the Mining Act. we have the Petroleum Commission Act. So the Petroleum Commission is the regulator of the upstream oil and gas sector. Moving forward, we'll begin to know what upstream oil and gas sector is. Then we also have the Petroleum Agreement. As the name implies, petroleum agreement, meaning it's an agreement that can be found or is related to the oil and gas sector. Okay, so it's actually stipulate a contractual relationship amongst the parties to a particular field or to a particular petroleum agreement. So once again, moving forward today, we'll get to know what a petroleum agreement is and its content as well. Then we also have the fiscal regime of the oil and gas industry. So the fiscal regime, as I said earlier, basically looks at how the oil and gas, its costs are shared and its benefits are shared. So worldwide, we have the royalty tax regime, we have the production sharing contract or the production sharing system. We also have the service contract, and then some school of thought are also of the view that a particular host government can apply all the three worldwide regimes. But bear in mind that the petroleum sector is a joint venture. Okay, so there are parties coming on board together with a particular host government, and then they are able to operate. Now, when you look at here, the carried interest, surface rental, signature bonus, they are tax revenues that are accruing from the oil and gas sector. But then it goes through some form of agreement. Okay, so moving forward today, again, we'll take a look at the distribution of crude oil, specifically in the case of Ghana. So even with a fiscal regime, at a point, there are some provisions. So for instance, when you take a look at the production sharing contract or the production sharing system, is a particular fiscal regime that mostly it is the state that has ownership to the oil and then the gas. And then it also makes provision for cost oil and then the profit oil. Okay, so as I do the brief overview, you get to know what cost oil is and you get to know what profit oil is. Then there are also tax revenues like the petroleum income tax, the withholding taxes. These are basically, when it comes to the corporate tax and then the withholding taxes, they cut across all the specific, all the various industries, not necessarily pertaining to the oil and gas sector. Then we also have another one called the Petroleum Revenue Management. Petroleum Revenue Management. We actually have an act that is called Petroleum Revenue Management. So as the name implies, in as much as government is ensuring participation from other parties pertaining to the exploitation of the natural resources in Ghana, such that government is able to obtain the tax revenues. Government also need to be able to manage these tax revenues. So the question is, how are these revenues managed? Or when these revenues are obtained, where does it go to? How are they accounted for? So that is what the Petroleum Revenue Management Act seeks to achieve. So hopefully we'll be taking a look at that next week, God willing. Now, when it comes to the natural resource industry, it's a highly regulated industry. So there are so many regulatory bodies that ensure the smooth operation of such an industry. And there are also committees as well. So sometimes we hear of the Investment Advisory Committee, which is the IAC, we have the PIAC, the Public Interest Accountability Committee. We also have the Joint Management Committee. Okay, so you need to know their compositions, their objectives, and then their functions. Mostly when it comes to these regulatory bodies, even we have Bank of Ghana, we have the Ghana Revenue Authority, because they all play a role. When it comes to these regulatory authorities or these bodies, I advise students to read on their own, because highly readable area, and it's also a highly examinable area as well. So please familiarize yourself with such area. Then we also have the minerals. So in our session, remember the course is divided into two. So we have oil, gas, and then the other mineral. So we'll take a look at the petroleum industry first, and then after we take a look at the mining industry. The petroleum and then the mining industry, honestly be told, are very similar industry, just a few differences when it comes to the taxation aspect. Okay, so we'll take a look at the petroleum industry first. Then after we take a look at the mining industry. So let me see if there are other, okay. So basically that is it. So with the concept that we are going to learn in the petroleum industry, then we carry forward such concept into the mining industry, and then we are good to go. Please, are you with me?
Yes, madam. Yeah.
Or you have left me?
Yeah. No, we are here.
Okay. Is there any question up to this point? Okay, that's fine. So now let's take a look at August 2024 question. Okay, so basically 5 questions in all. This cut across all the other courses, and it's 3-hour written paper. Okay, before the 3-hour paper, or before you start, after the sharing of the answer sheet and all that you're supposed to have, you'll be given some minutes of reading, where you be asked to, or it depends on you, but reading time, meaning you have to read. So you need to be able to read through, and then you kickstart when you are given the go ahead. So in our session, I'll be dropping some, let's say, examination tips that you are supposed to be abreast with as a professional student preparing for a professional paper. Let me put it that way. So it's different knowing the answer, and it is different presenting the answer. And funny enough, it is the presentation of the answer that is going to earn as the marks. It's not what you actually know. Just that if you present the wrong thing, then you would lose mark. But if you present the right thing, then you are definitely going to make it. So in as much as I encourage us that, of course, understanding is very, very key. Because when it comes to professional papers, there are 3 main categories of questions that have been asked. So the first one is the theoretical question. Okay, the second one, we have the application questions, and the third one, we have the computation questions. So you need to be able to understand the question, know the type of question that is being asked, then you can appropriately present your answers. So looking at question 1A, discuss the key benefits associated with surface right. Honestly, you will not find benefits of surface right. You will not find it. Okay, but with your understanding of what the surface right is, you'll be able to write the benefits. So this is actually an application question. Then outline the 3 stages of upstream petroleum operations and their tax implications. So this is a pure theoretical question. When you know it, you can write on it. If you don't know, you will not be able to produce the right answer, and that is going to go against you. But for application questions, provided you have an understanding of it, you can then apply your understanding to the question. Okay, so you really need to get an understanding of what you are coming to do. And then you also need to familiarize yourself with the theoretical aspect as well. Mostly students focus on the computation aspects. I don't know why, maybe because it's a tax course, so students really want to know the taxes, and then they are so much into the tax computation, forgetting that it's actually both theoretical and computation question. And interesting to note that if you are able to really grasp the theoretical aspect, and let's say you go into the examination hall and about 50% of it is theory, you are fine. And again, in writing or in answering a theoretical question, you do not need a lot of effort compared to answering a computation question. So you realize that you're going to spend maybe an hour or an hour and 15 minutes, because remember, it's a 3-hour paper, 5 questions. So technically 35 minutes to every paper. So you cannot ignore the theoretical aspects and then you focus so much on the computation questions, because the computation questions can come from anywhere. Okay, it can even come from the theoretical aspect. And then one of the topics, unitization, we'll be looking at that today as well. It's a purely theoretical concept, but there was a point in time that there was a computation on it. So if you don't also understand that, you cannot be able to answer. So please, I entreat all of us to pay particular attention of the theoretical aspect as well, not only the computation aspect. Okay. So now we look at question 2. Question 2 says that countries grant exploration and production rights to oil and gas companies under various contractual arrangements, but there are 3 main ones referred to as host government contract or world fiscal system for oil and gas. So that is what I was talking about earlier on. A, identify and explain the main features of the 3 host government. This is also a theoretical question. Then B, specify and explain the contractual arrangement under which Ghana grants exploration and production rights to oil and gas companies. So now we move on to the C. What is the rationale for empowering the Minister of Lands and Mineral Resources to enter into a stability agreement with a holder of a mining lease? So this is purely an application question. You need to know what a stability agreement is. You need to know what a mining lease, for that matter, the holder of a mining lease, who that person is. Then you can be able to apply your understanding to the question. Okay, so we also move on to question 3. Question 3, write short notes on the following. Whenever you see write short, in fact, in every sitting, you need to prepare for such a question, write short notes, which also implies that because the oil and gas and then the mining is a highly specialized industry, and perhaps even some of us may be in such an industry, or some of us are not in such an industry. So you need to familiarize yourself with the terminologies, which is very, very key. So every act, every law that you read pertaining to such an industry, you realize that we have definitions section. Kindly always go through the definitions, because you don't know where the terminologies are going to be examined. You don't know which ones, you don't know. And they are quite a lot. But whenever you read it and you go through the definitions, with time, you get abreast to it. Now, when you see write short notes on the following, write short notes. Writing short note doesn't necessarily connote that you are to write 1 or 2 lines. No. It actually implies that you are to write all that you know, or all that is pertaining to that particular terminology or that particular concept. You are to write on everything about it. So basically producing all the facts pertaining to such terminology or such concept It doesn't mean that you have to write 1 or 2 lines. No. So please take note of that. Now, looking at question 4 and 5. So mostly question 1 to 3 are theoretical questions. Theoretical questions. And then question 4 and 5 are competition questions. Okay. And question 4, whether it could be question 4 or question 5, one is from oil and gas, and then one is from the mining sector. So for the competition questions, I'm not really going to delve much into it or read it, because you are yet to even understand the basics. Then we can be able to apply our understanding to the competition question. Okay, before we move on, please, do we have any questions? No questions so far.
No, madam.
Okay. Please give me a second. In today's session, we are going to take a look at the natural resources in Ghana, petroleum reserves, classification of oil reserves, crude oil, petroleum operations, characteristics of the oil and gas industry, the risk associated with petroleum activities, then the legal and regulatory framework of the upstream petroleum operations in Ghana. So basically, it's going to give us a background of what goes into the oil and gas sector. But before every session, I like to do a brief overview so that we get to understand it better, since some of us may not be in the oil and gas sector. So the first on the bill is the natural resources. The natural resources. So natural resources, as we all know, understand, they are resources that is not man-made. That is not man-made. But some natural resources provide some form of revenue to the host government. So that is how come we have the mining, the oil and gas, the bauxite, the timber, the manganese. Basically, when it comes to the natural resource, in its classification, you can classify it according to its source and then according to its characteristics. So with the source, we can have the water bodies. So we have the river, the streams. We can also have the land. We can also have the forest. So depending on what we are looking at. But when it comes to its characteristics, depending on the nature of the resource that we are looking at. So for instance, we can have inexhaustible resource, meaning that so far as man consumes it, it does not get finished. So for instance, we can take a look at the sunlight. So the sunlight is an inexhaustible resource. We also have renewable resource. So for the renewable resource, it gets regenerated as and when by natural means. So we can take a look at our water bodies. We can take a look at our forest, our trees, how it begins to grow even when you cut it down. Then we also have the non-renewable resource. But please let me chip in this as we move on. If you have any questions, any contributions, any submission you want to do, just feel free and then alert me on it. Okay, it's not a one-way lecture. Let me put it that way. We need to also interact. So anything that you want to bring on board, just feel free and then share. So coming back with a non-renewable resource, this is a type of resource that once it gets used or once it gets depleted, it cannot be replaced. Okay, so an instance is the oil and then the gas. We also have the gold, the diamond. Okay, once it gets depleted, it cannot be replaced. Then we also have the biotic resource. So with the biotic resource, it mostly stems from living organisms. So like our plants, be it our food crops, as long as it's from a living organism. Then we also have the abiotic. So with the abiotic, they are from non-living organisms. Okay, so we can say that the oil, gas, and then the metals, the gold, they are all the abiotic. They are all some form of abiotic resources. Okay, then we also have the energy resources. So those are the kind of resources that gives us energy. So you can have the sun, we can have the oil. So these are some of the types of the resources when we take a look at the characteristics of the resources. So now the question is, who owns the natural resource? Who owns the natural resource? Okay, who owns the natural resource? So yeah, according to the Constitution of Ghana, power is vested in the President of Ghana to manage these resources on behalf of the people of Ghana. Okay, so which means that if we should find any form of the natural resources at a particular place, one cannot just stand up, or an individual cannot just stand up and say that, oh, because it was found beneath wherever I'm staying, then it belongs to me. No. Obviously, some consultations would need to be done because power is vested in the President of Ghana to manage the resources on behalf of the people of Ghana. Technically, that resource belongs to the people of Ghana, but it is the president that has been given the mandate to manage these resources. That is how come we have certain regulators like the Petroleum Commission, the National Petroleum Authority. We have the oil and gas, the National Oil and Gas Operator, that is GNPC. So now take note that there's a difference between GNPC and the Petroleum Commission. The Petroleum Commission regulates the upstream sector of Ghana. We'll be looking at the various sectors in the petroleum industry of Ghana. So the Petroleum Commission regulates the upstream sector. It is not the GNPC. The GNPC is the National Oil Company of Ghana. So when you take every petroleum agreement or every petroleum operation, GNPC is always a party to that petroleum operation or that field. It's more or less GNPC is the representative of the government of Ghana to every petroleum operation. Okay, so please take note, there's a difference between GNPC and then the Petroleum Commission. Now let's take a look at what is a reserve, because in the outline, we were seeing petroleum reserve, classification of the oil reserve. So what is a reserve? Now, when it comes to the petroleum industry of Ghana, let me quickly go over the sectors. Okay, when it comes to the petroleum industry of Ghana, sorry. Okay, so now we are looking at the sectors of the petroleum industry. We have the upstream sector, which is regulated by the Petroleum Commission, backed by the Petroleum Commission Act. So the petroleum sector is an aspect of the petroleum industry that is mainly into the exploitation of the resource. Okay, yeah, mainly into the exploitation of the oil and then the gas. That is the upstream sector. So, of course, before any operator or any contractor would want to be engaged in such a sector, you first of all need to obtain a license. You first of all need to obtain a license or a right, which is very, very important. So there are several phases under the upstream sector, and the phases will give more understanding into what goes on into the upstream sector. So the first phase, you need to take a look at the acquisition of the right or the license, acquisition of the right of or the license. So even with respect to the acquisition of the right of the license, there are also certain procedures that must be undertaken. An application will need to be made. And the application will be forwarded to GNPC. GNPC will take a look at it. The negotiation team would be formed before it will be taken to Parliament, and then it will be ratified by Parliament. So it is out of this stage that we have the petroleum agreement. Remember, every petroleum operation is a joint venture. So there are two or more aside GNPC, who is always a party to the petroleum agreement or to the petroleum operation, and of which GNPC does not need to enter into a petroleum agreement if GNPC would also want to undertake a petroleum operation, because GNPC is the National Oil Company of Ghana, meaning that they can also undertake petroleum operation, but they are not a regulator. Okay, it is Petroleum Commission that is the regulator of the upstream sector of Ghana. So it is only GNPC that does not have to enter into a petroleum agreement before going into the petroleum operations. But aside that, any other investor, any other operator will need to enter into a petroleum agreement. So once the agreement is ratified, then we are good to go. So then they can then go to the exploration phase, the exploration phase. So it is at this stage or at this phase that certain activities are conducted to actually indicate or to actually look for or search for the oil and gas. Now, the oil and gas can exist either onshore or offshore. So the onshore, basically land. The offshore, you can take a look at the water bodies. Okay, it's found beneath the earth's surface. Remember, before we started this main session, I made mention that you need to understand what really goes into the industry before you can even apply the tax issues. So that is what we are doing now. Now, if a contractor or whoever will want to undertake a petroleum operation, you first of all need to acquire a right or obtain a license. Then you can go to the exploration phase. It is at the exploration phase that a contractor or the operator would need to carry out certain activities to actually search whether the oil exists or not. And this is a very, very important phase. Now, mind you that in as much as the activities are being undertaken and information is being gathered, if the interpretation of the information is wrong, then automatically whatever action that the operators are going to take would also be wrong. So here we mostly have an exploratory activity that is being conducted. We call it the seismic exploration, the seismic exploration. So this is actually one of the most used exploratory activity, or let me say exploratory mechanic that is being used in the oil and gas industry. Because remember, the oil and gas exists beneath the land and then in the deep waters. So basically what happens is that there's a decomposition of the materials that is down there. And that is what, because of the nature of the activity that is being going underneath, you realize that the oil and gas will now begin to fall because of the decomposition. So what happens is that how will the operators begin to know whether the oil exists here or not? Obviously, we as human beings, we cannot be able to go beneath the earth's surface. So that is how come we have technology. Technology will be able to help us. All these that I'm saying is going to feed into the understanding of what a reserve is. When we talk of an oil reserve, what does it mean? Please, I hope you are following me.
Yes,
Hello, are you
madam.
with me?
Yes, please.
Yes,
Madam.
yeah.
Okay. So now let's take a look at seismic exploration. So as I was saying earlier, we have technologies that can be able to be applied by the operators or the contractors. So they pick information from beneath the earth's surface and then they get interpreted. Then they can be able to know whether the oil exists or not. Now, for business purposes, the oil, even though if it exists, one will need to assess the capability that one has. Sometimes the oil can exist, but then the operators or the contractors or even the host government may not have the technology to tap into the oil. That means pumping the oil from beneath the earth's surface back to the surface of the earth such that it can be tapped into and then refined and then and so forth and so forth. So sometimes technology constraints can also restrain a particular host government or a contractor from tapping into the oil. So here we have certain equipment called the geophones and then the hydrophones. Depending on whether we are operating on the land or in the deep sea, we will need to take a look at whether you are using geophone or hydrophone. But basically, the geophones or the hydrophones pick up sounds from beneath the earth's surface and then it gets interpreted and then they can be able to make an informed decision. So after the exploration phase, it is this seismic exploration that would then lead us to evaluation and then appraisal. Because after the seismic exploratory activity is undertaken, they will need to assess the information that is being gathered, which is very, very important. So when the information is gathered and then they are sure that the oil exists and it exists in commercial quantities. Commercial quantities meaning that they can sell it and then they will be able to make some form of profit. It's very, very important. Okay, so that is when they will then go to the development stage. So the exploratory stage, basically, you can just say that, okay, it's basically to look for the oil. Does the oil exist or not? If it exists, does it exist in commercial quantities? Then we move on to the development stage. Hello, can you hear me?